Good morning, everybody. Professor Bettina Donnerlein, Professor Mohammed Sgher, dear doctoral students, on behalf of the Permanent Secretary of the Academy of the Kingdom of Morocco, I highly appreciate your presence and interest in attending this huge fifth seminar led by one of the distinguished scholars, the Professor Bettina Donnerlein, on the subject, When is Reform Locating iṣlāḥ in Comparative Perspective? And if I can translate it, I'll say in Arabic, متى يكون الإصلاح تحديد موقع الإصلاح من منظور مقارن. On your behalf, I express my sincere thanks to her for agreeing to lead this seminar. She is full professor of gender and Islamic Studies at the Institute of Asian and Oriental Studies at the University of Zurich. She received her philosophy doctor in 1997 from the Free University in Berlin. She has been granted fellowships at Institute for Advanced Studies, Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and Maison des Sciences in Paris. In April 2000, she joined the Center of Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin too, and later Humboldt University in Berlin as a senior researcher. From 2007 to 2009, she was professor for the history of the modern Arab world, Islamic Studies at the University of Hamburg. I am sure that in addition to practice your English, you will learn and deepen your knowledge with her and wish you a good seminar. Thank you very much, and I give the floor to the Sir Mohammed Sgher.
Bonjour tout le monde. Permettez-moi, chers collègues, de remercier infiniment le professeur Bettina Donnerlein qui a accepté notre invitation pour participer à ce cycle de séminaires sur l'iṣlāḥ, la réforme en terre d'islam, 18e, 19e, 20e siècle. Je réitère mes remerciements pour l'Académie des Royaumes qui a aussi eu la volonté d'abriter ces séminaires parce qu'ils sont plusieurs et aussi de contribuer à la formation de nos doctorants et de nos jeunes chercheurs. Mes remerciements vont aussi à nos collègues chercheurs qui nous font l'honneur et l'amitié de participer à ce séminaire. Juste un petit rappel. Pourquoi justement un séminaire sur la réforme, le réformisme en terre d'islam? Nous nous sommes rendus compte que depuis maintenant quelques années, qu'il y a dans la recherche internationale énormément de débats et de paradigmes nouveaux concernant l'histoire des réformismes en terre d'islam. Parce que pendant longtemps, c'était un discours arabo-centré, tel qu'on nous l'avons appris à l'école, puis à l'université au Maroc et ailleurs dans le monde arabe, et que le monde de l'islam est un monde vaste et assez diversifié, et que la thématique de l'iṣlāḥ a traversé le monde musulman de l'Asie centrale jusqu'au monde iranien, jusqu'au Maghreb, etc. Et il n'y avait pas que Bilad Sham, le Levant et l'Égypte pour se prendre en charge cette thématique. Donc, pour avoir une idée justement sur ces transformations aussi bien épistémologiques, méthodologiques, etc., que connaissent les études sur l'iṣlāḥ et l'histoire religieuse en général de l'islam, nous avons conçu un cycle de séminaires qui est intégré dans une sorte de réflexion sur les rapports des musulmans à leur patrimoine et à leur histoire en général. Et nous avons commencé ce cycle au début de l'année 2023 avec Mohammed Haddad, qui est quand même un des chercheurs arabes qui a le plus contribué à l'étude de l'iṣlāḥ au Moyen-Orient. et qui a en plus poussé sa réflexion pour une théorie générale de l'iṣlāḥ qui intègre l'expérience arabo-musulmane dans une sorte de paradigme beaucoup plus théorique en montant en généralisation théorique. Ce qui est intéressant pour la recherche dans le monde arabe, qui ne reste pas localisé sur des thématiques purement locales, mais qu'il s'intègre dans des réflexions générales et mondiales sur des thématiques comme l'iṣlāḥ. Après, c'est Mohamed Afif a poussé l'approche comparative entre la réforme au Japon, la réforme au Moyen-Orient, avec des comparaisons, en restituant les processus politiques, économiques et sociaux qui ont commandé l'iṣlāḥ dans les deux régions, en prenant une altérité assez radicale comme le Japon pour faire des comparaisons assez intéressantes au niveau méthodologique et théorique. Et comme en général, nous connaissons généralement que le réformisme arabe, musulman, plutôt sunnite, nous avons demandé à Madame Sabrina Mervin de nous parler justement de ses travaux, de ce qu'il a fait sur le réformisme chiite dans Jabal Amil et aussi au Liban, bien sûr, en Irak et également en Iran. Et dernièrement, c'est Aziz Ismail a plutôt jeté une lumière intéressante sur l'aspect philosophique et théologique dans le patrimoine islamique et son rapport avec la thématique de l'iṣlāḥ. Nous sommes aujourd'hui vraiment ravis parce que Madame Bettina Denerlein va boucler ce cycle de séminaire sur l'iṣlāḥ. Et c'est vraiment sa participation est très très intéressante pour nous, pour plusieurs raisons. D'abord, Madame Denerlein nous permettra de revenir sur le cas marocain, qui nous intéresse au premier degré, bien sûr, pas seulement à partir des considérations d'appartenance à ce pays, mais aussi pour faire le point de vue du savoir sur les questions spécifiques du cas marocain, parce que, comme je vous ai dit, il y a plusieurs expériences, et l'expérience marocaine est là aussi ses spécificités. Et donc, son travail sur la religion comme réforme, iṣlāḥ et société au Maroc, 1830-1912, constitue une contribution intéressante dans ses réflexions sur l'iṣlāḥ au Maroc. Deuxième point, c'est que ça nous intéresse parce que également, il ne s'est pas intéressé seulement au côté religieux, au côté politique dans ses études. Elle a travaillé, comme ça a été dit, sur les questions, l'étude de genre, le droit islamique, de la famille, le féminisme, les changements sociopolitiques, et notamment en Afrique du Nord. Et ce qui est aussi intéressant dans ce qu'il nous propose dans ces séminaires, c'est qu'elle est l'une des rares qui va répondre complètement au cahier de charge sur ce séminaire-là, parce qu'il va prendre en considération aussi bien scientifiquement le contenu, le discours de l'iṣlāḥ, y compris dans ses sources marocaines, mais il abordera aussi les liens complexes entre réformisme et discours décoloniaux, ce qui est aussi une dimension très intéressante dans l'analyse de la question de l'iṣlāḥ, et puis les transformations que connaissent les discours réformistes à la lumière des mutations médiatiques, les reconfigurations de la sphère publique, sans oublier évidemment un moment consacré à la synthèse théorique, les conceptuelle et méthodologique. On en sommes, nous, sur les questions de la théorie de l'iṣlāḥ et du réformisme. Donc, ces points vous montrent que nous avons de la chance d'assister à ce séminaire qui ferme ce cycle, qui va boucler en quelque sorte ce cycle et qui, je suppose, je l'espère, sera un pas en avant dans l'approche de ces questions du XIXe siècle et des processus de modernisation dans les sociétés arabo-musulmanes. Et je réitère mes remerciements à Dr Denerlein pour sa contribution à ce séminaire et merci infiniment.
Sabah al-Khair, bonjour, good morning everyone. Let me start by thanking my colleagues for the invitation and also for the kind introduction by Professor Janjar. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here at this prestigious university and to participate in what I consider to be a really important format, so to have young researchers from Morocco meet people from abroad in order to exchange and develop ideas on existing research and hopefully new research produced by yourself over a week. So at the same time, for me, being in Rabat always feels like coming home, because since the early 2000s I regularly came here, first during my postdoc research and then for different new projects and collaborations with colleagues in Morocco. And I just learned that some of you are from history departments, others from English studies departments, and actually my contacts relate to both communities. Let me also stress that it is really a special honor and pleasure, and indeed the very first time that I am invited to teach here in Rabat, which will probably be over the next days a quite intensive experience with, I hope, many possibilities to exchange with you, young scholars. Personally, I consider teaching and accompanying young researchers. In German, we speak of academic Nachwuchs, which literally means offspring. Of course, this is not that we claim the ownership, but we want to stress with this expression the young talents or upcoming scholars. So these are really, teaching and accompanying young researchers are really, for me, the most important parts of my work as a professor. I'm therefore really very much looking forward also to getting to know you, to learning from your questions and your comments, to know more about your experience and your expertise and background in your different projects and fields of study. And I would also be happy to learn more about what would be helpful to you from my side. So please feel free to raise any issues you have today and over the next days. This said, I have always collaborated with colleagues in Morocco and in other countries of the Middle East and North Africa. Until today, together with my team at the University of Zurich, we run several collaborative projects in the field of research, but also of teaching. And among others, there is a newly founded Swiss-Arab network of young researchers in gender and diversity studies. And if any of you would be interested to join, please tell me about your interest, and I will put you in contact with the people who run this network. I'm thrilled to have the chance to exchange with you. Those of you who are from history departments, you follow up on several generations of Moroccan historians since the country's independence. You inherit a rich tradition in research and teaching in the field of Moroccan history, and you can really build on important groundwork laid by previous Moroccan historians of Morocco in decolonizing the discipline, but also in rethinking the role of the discipline in university and beyond the university. So what is the role of research? This concerns also English studies departments for the society at large. Allow me to add another preliminary observation concerning the issue of language. I am indeed aware of the fact that English is not yet the language of teaching in Moroccan universities, as it is still not the case everywhere in Switzerland. In addition, I'm aware and also concerned about the lack of recognition of other languages in international academia. German, my native language, is itself a minor language in the European context. Regrettably, Arabic is even more so in a situation of marginalization, in spite of the many speakers of Arabic and also in spite of the important research that is produced and published in Arabic, and we have just been discussing some of the examples. I therefore think that initiatives such as the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, the ACCS, which advocates for the advancement of social sciences in the Arabic language are still much needed and most welcome. This said, as you all know, the Maghreb and Morocco are not monolingual spaces, and among others I would just like to mention the important work by Fatima Siddiqui on language, gender and power in Morocco. Actually, we have a similar situation in Switzerland, where there are 3 administrative, official and 4 national languages, which are positioned quite differently in terms of numbers of speakers, but also in terms of power or prestige. So German is clearly dominant, together perhaps with French, Italian much less. And then when it comes to Rheto-Romanic or Romansh, which is actually a group of small Roman languages spoken in the Swiss Alps, it is only spoken in these regions or at home. So we also have this situation of monolingualism, of not having monolingualism, and also a situation of a strong difference between written languages and spoken languages. I nevertheless decided to give my lectures in English, which is probably for all of us a foreign language. But what I will try to do is to insert short summaries in my presentations in either Arabic or French. So I need to ask you in advance for your tolerance for linguistic shortcomings in all of these languages and in switching between them. And please feel free yourself to raise questions or make comments in Arabic, French, or English. So we have also in Switzerland a saying that goes chacun, or we could also say chacune dans sa langue. Donc chacun, chacune dans sa langue, and we agree that we will all understand what the other is saying. If there are any misunderstandings, I'm sure that my distinguished colleague and dear friend, Professor Khalid Ben Srir, who is here for the next days, who is not only an excellent historian himself, but also a well-known and experienced translator of academic works, will jump in and support me. Last but not least, the issue of translation beyond a purely technical meaning of translation, so to translate from one language to the other, will also be a topic of my lecture today and the following lectures. In research, I consider translation also as an analytic perspective, in that concepts that we translate not only between languages, but also between scientific disciplines or between social fields, are, to quote cultural analyst Mieke Baal, the sites of debate, of awareness and of difference, also of tentative exchange. And there exists also the expression of intraduisible or intranslatables, which does not mean that there are concepts that we cannot translate because they are so unique. This is not the idea. The idea is to say that there are concepts that we need to rethink in translating because they may mean very different things. So it's also a good exercise against the taking concepts for granted and thinking they're simply there and it's just our way of looking at them or understanding them that is valid. So it has also an analytic perspective if we talk about translation. As a very last point, let me add that starting from my second lecture as of tomorrow, I will from time to time interrupt my presentations in the morning and ask you to either briefly discuss for 3 or 5 minutes on a specific issue or question, murmuring with your shoulder partner, so the person sitting next to you, or to write a so-called 1-minute paper, which means that you sit and think for yourself about a question or an issue for 3 to 5 minutes. And in each case, you are invited after this moment or this break to share your questions and thoughts. Both techniques, shoulder partner discussions and 1-minute papers, are, as you probably know, tools developed in the field of higher education to enhance the quality of teaching and especially to support effective, or what we also like to call active learning. Because we know from research and learning that if someone is there and tries to explain something to you and you simply listen passively, nothing is transmitted. So we need to have some kind of exchange and already an active, involvement also of listeners during the course. I am, of course, aware that you are here to learn about my research, and you rightfully expect me to share my thoughts, my ideas, my findings with you over the next days, and be assured that I will do exactly that. Yet, I always consider my teaching also as an invitation to participate in a collective endeavor of thinking and learning in conversation. So for my teaching, I also depend on you responding to what I'm saying. The 4 lectures I have prepared for you will have a similar structure, treating the different topics that you are aware of because they have been distributed to you. Each time I will start by briefly explaining what I will do and why I choose a specific perspective on the overall theme of iṣlāḥ. I will then shortly mention the readings that have been distributed to you to, if you like, map the field of research. And then I will speak about the major topic from my perspective based on my research, but I will also draw on the readings that have been distributed to you. So with this, let me turn to my first lecture entitled Colonial Translations. And this first lecture is special also formally because it is transmitted on the YouTube channel of the Académiة, so it will be slightly more formal than my following lectures, in order to allow also the public that is not prepared by the readings and by communication to what I'm going to say. So the first lecture is mainly based on my book, and I can pass it around, thank you. Religion as Reform, iṣlāḥ and Society in Morocco, or الدين كإصلاح الإصلاح والمجتمع في المغرب, published in 2018. Looking at the title of the book, you might be astonished that I choose to talk about colonial translations here today, because neither of the terms appears in the title. So why did I choose to frame my lecture today in terms of colonial translations? I will have the possibility to talk more about post- and decolonial approaches in research. Today, let me simply share with you my basic understanding of colonial here in colonial translations, specifically focusing on Morocco in the late 19th and early 20th century. My definition or my approach to the colonial builds on Michel Camus, political scientist, specialist of the Maghreb. Michel Camus has characterized North African states, or I would rather say polities, so that we don't think of them in terms of modern nation states. So he defines or describes the polities in North Africa over the 19th century as, I quote, states in between eras. So, if you like, كالدول في فترة زمنية بين العصور أو بين عصرين. What does he mean by this? Camus, with this description, he wants to stress that externally, North African polities were increasingly operating within a still consolidating in the 19th century system of nation states dominated by Europe. So this process was still not concluded completely in Europe neither. So they increasingly operated within this consolidating system of European dominated nation states, which granted North African polities control over a specific territory, over the population and over resources, but at the same time, this system also held them accountable for maintaining the frontiers, for controlling the population, and for allowing Europeans to have access to resources. So these were like contradicting challenges for North African polities. Internally, North African polities continue to rely on mediated and socially embedded relationships of recognition being based on multiple forms of negotiation processes. So you have this discrepancy between the external and the internal. يعني ميشيل كامو وصف الدول المغاربية في القرن التاسع عشر كدول في فترة زمنية بين العصور أو بين عصرين. من الناحية الخارجية كانوا يتصرفوا تحت ظروف مهيمنة أو مجبرة من قبل أوروبا وفي إطار نظام جديد متميز بنموذج الدولة الوطنية. ومن الناحية الداخلية استمروا في الاعتماد على علاقات التعرف الاجتماعي وعمليات التفاوض. So please help me if this is not clear. I take this also as an opportunity to again say something on translation. So let me repeat that in the title of my lecture, Colonial Translation, I do not use the term in the narrow sense of translation as I just performed it here, but I use it in a broader perspective of cultural studies and cultural analysis. The translational or translational in this context refers to a shift in the way scholars understand or approach culture and cultural phenomena. Culture, according to this approach, is no longer understood as a static system or a container of fixed ideas, but rather as a system of meanings and of also power relations that is constructed and changes over time. So it is made and remade, it is imposed and challenged at the same time. يعني الثقافة هنا ليست كيان متماسك لا يتغير بنية. يؤكد هذا المنظور على أهمية الترجمة ليس فقط من حيث اللغة، بل الترجمة هنا في نفس الوقت تفهم كعمليات بناء وتبادل داخل ثقافة واحدة أو إلى الترجمة بين ثقافات. So with this, let me switch to shortly presenting the readings I have suggested for this lecture, and in order for our external public to follow, let me briefly look again at the exact information. So what I tried to do by selecting the readings is to, of course I had to choose just a few readings because you can't read a whole library for this week. So I needed to be very selective. But what I tried to do is to cover certain systematic aspects. The first was to look at in a comparative perspective, at the complexity of processes of reception of Ottoman reformist politics in North Africa. And for this, I choose the reading by James McDougall, a specialist especially of colonial and decolonial Algeria, a text entitled Crisis and Recovery Narratives in Maghrebi Histories of the Ottoman Period, published in 2011. So he looks at how the Ottoman Empire was perceived in Tunisia and in Algeria, and how this perception was more a function, if you like, of internal developments than really a process of looking and learning or adopting something from the Ottoman Empire. The two other readings are more concerned about the intellectual history of iṣlāḥ and related reformist movements like the cultural renaissance or revival movement of the Nahda in the Arab East over the 19th century. So I selected two readings here, one by Marwa El-Shakri, published in 2016 as a chapter to the book Global Spencerism, and it looks at Spencer's Arabic readers. So this is the title of the chapter. And I selected the text by Samah Salim, published in 2009, on languages of civilization, where she looks also into how philosophical or sociological works from contemporary European authors in the 19th century have been translated into Arabic, and via the translation they have been also adapted rather than adopted and changed and how to say, connected to internal debates. So this was important for me to stress that we do not talk about either taking something from Middle Eastern experiences or from Europe, but that we need to look into the specific entanglements and forms of adaptation of new concepts and new models of social and political organization, always as being part of the internal dynamics in a specific setting. So again, before turning to my book, let me start with another caveat. As you know, I'm not a general historian of Morocco, but I have studied specific aspects and moments in Moroccan history. I am sure that you are, those of you who are from history departments and probably also from your baccalaureate, you are much more knowledgeable about Moroccan history in general, and you might, through your research, be more aware of archival sources that have been recently made available and more recent publications in Morocco. So my contribution here is, first of all, to discuss with you and look at questions of how we read sources, how we identify sources, how we approach sources, and how we formulate questions and research topics. يعني مساهمتي هنا اليوم تتعلق في المقام الأول بالاقتراب من المصادر وصياغة موادع البحث وأسئلة البحث. So I want to look at this more specifically with you. Let me just see if I left out something. No. So, all that being said, it is a great pleasure for me to revisit for this lecture a research project. I hope the book is now with you, that started more than 2 decades ago here in the city of Rabat. During those years in the early 2000s, I had the privilege of receiving encouragement and support from many Moroccan colleagues during extended research stays in local archives and libraries. These colleagues not only introduced me to the universe of historical research in Morocco, but they also opened many doors for me, sometimes even the doors of their homes, and some initiated me into the deciphering of difficult-to-read manuscripts and their subsequent analysis. And so I'm especially honored and happy that Khalid Ben Sghir, who was really a key person for me to support me during these first years, is with us today. I'm aware of the fact that you have already been listening to a number of presentations on iṣlāḥ and reformist debates in the Arab world and beyond. And so let me try to perhaps react to what Professor Janja has said about the general topic and then about the presentations that you have followed up to now in order to position my own contribution. You have already mentioned that I will bring back the Moroccan terrain, but at the same time I also want us to think about Morocco in a comparative perspective and in a perspective of entanglements. So what can a book about such a topic can contribute, and how do I relate in my research to existing studies on iṣlāḥ? Let me say that simplifying and pushing the point a little bit, one could say that over a long period, Middle East or Islamic studies have treated iṣlāḥ as a specifically Islamic notion, or sometimes even an idea of renewal, renovation, restoration of an original, pure or authentic Islam, an idea the roots of which go back to the Quran, and an idea that is firmly rooted in the history of Islamic thought. There are several notions that are related or connected to the idea of iṣlāḥ, like notably salah, muslih, or salih, but also the idea of tajdīd or the mujaddid are very present in the research on iṣlāḥ, on religious reform, or let's say Islamically framed reform. So not that we judge what is religious and what is not religious, but that we look at how authors frame their approach. And I can suggest as a reading which you might already be aware of, the entry iṣlāḥ in the Encyclopedia of Islam, edited by Brill in Leiden. The article is authored by Ali Marad, whom you might know as a historian of Algeria and of reformist Islam in Algeria. And he really explains the wide semantic field of iṣlāḥ, based on a Quranic understanding and then the model of the Prophet Muhammad, that it is connected to ideas of working towards peace and social harmony, that it is a collective and an individual endeavor to change or make better the life of real Muslims. So it has also a real world existence. It is not simply an idea. And it is especially in the pre-modern period related to the idea of fighting against fasad or bid'ah, or connected to the Quranic injunction al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy an al-munkar. So there are quite different, let's say, genres and topics that we need to look at to understand this notion of iṣlāḥ in the perspective of a history of ideas. Then when it comes to modernity and modern interpretations of iṣlāḥ, the classical, and I refer again to Ali Murad's entry here, the classical version of the story would say that put under pressure by colonialism and by cultural reformist movements like the Nahda, and by political reforms in Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, Islamic scholars would start to rethink the notion of iṣlāḥ in order to make it compatible with modernization. So in order to translate it into new conceptual universes. So to read Islam as an expression for society, for nation, for civilization. So to reinterpret this notion. And then there are several specific points that are usually mentioned in order to say, or to make us aware of from which issues this modernist notion of iṣlāḥ emerged. And very often it is the critique of traditional forms of scholarship, it's critique of taqlid, it's critique especially also of Sufism and specific Sufi practices, veneration of saints, or everything that is connected to popular practices. This is, as I said, the classical story. And also it is another point that is always mentioned to describe and further analyze modernist notions of iṣlāḥ is the issue of political reforms, of the building of the nation state, nationalism, anti-imperialism. So modernist iṣlāḥ in the more conventional perspective emerges from a critique of local traditional practices and in exchange with new modern concepts. So this would be the conventional story. Now there is a huge debate on whether this is adequate, whether we should not rather look also at modernist articulations of iṣlāḥ as being much more based on an Islamic tradition of reform. So there's new research that argues that there are different temporalities and continuities between pre-modern and modern, so that question also this division. And I will not go into the detail of this whole research. You are already familiar with some of it, but I would stay with this more conventional story in order to contrast my own approach to iṣlāḥ, or to better explain my own approach. And what first intrigued me was that when we look into sources, and peu importe si c'est des sources marocaines ou moyen-orientales, so what we find is that iṣlāḥ is employed in the sources in quite different ways. So there is not one idea or one discourse of iṣlāḥ. This already points to a certain danger that we retrospectively project a predefined notion of iṣlāḥ on different forms of discourses. So actually, if we look, for example, at the Middle Eastern press and public debates at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, iṣlāḥ emerges as a term related to quite different domains, including education, politics, family, and many others. And it is not always clear whether, and if so, how, there was really an engagement with more specifically Islamic traditions. In the case of Morocco, we must consider also that the press and printed books, as you know, played really only a minor role at this time compared to the Middle East. So in his study, الخطاب الإصلاحي في المغرب, philosopher and social scientist Abdallah Belqaziz suggests, therefore, that we reconstruct the earliest forms of modern reformist thinking in Morocco within traditional genres of scholarship. So we don't need to look at like modernist manifests or articles in the press, but we might find something in traditional genres, such as writings against blameworthy innovations, or so-called kutub al-bid'ah. Belqaziz has argued that in Morocco, al-khitab al-islahi, so Islamic reformism, emerged first as part of transmitted forms of Islamic legal discourse. So it was not critiquing Islamic legal discourse, but referring to Islamic legal discourses as they were established in order to critique contemporary social and political phenomena. Only later did al-khitab al-islahi then turn itself against the culture of the ulama and religious traditionalist scholarship. And then again later, especially in the 1980s and 50s, it turned its attention to the political level and increasingly engaged with issues of nationalism, independence, society as a new term, etc. Following Alal al-Fasi, who, as you all know, is a major protagonist himself of reformist Islam and of nationalism in Morocco, Belqaziz calls this later trend of the 1930s and 50s a Salafiyya al-Jadida. And this has been also then, the expression, I think, goes back to Alal al-Fasi, and it has been then traveling through research on the Middle East also. So you would find articles and books on Morocco that use this notion without questioning where it came from and without asking who coined this expression, what was the context, etc. So it became now like a terminus technicus, the Salafiyya Jadida. So Belqaziz talks about the Salafiyya al-Jadida, or Neo-Salafism, to distinguish it from earlier modernist Salafiyya discourses as they emerged in the 19th and 20th century in the Middle East. So it is to stress the specificity of the Moroccan development, which had another, if you like, rhythm and temporality. Building on existing research, also on research by Moroccan specialists, my book then sought to move away from the focus on ideas or predefined notions of Islamic reform in order to follow more closely what we might call the social life of iṣlāḥ as it emerged in different forms across different genres and authors and discourses. So this is also why in my book I call iṣlāḥ not an idea or a fixed concept, because I consider that it was not yet a fixed concept, and even today there might be different concepts. I look at iṣlāḥ in my book as what I termed a discursive figure. So Surat al-Khitab, if you like. A discursive figure, not to start from a predefined understanding. And I draw here on the specialist of Germanic literatures, Caroline Thora-Mattenklot, who has written extensively on the notion of figure of thought, so Sura Fikriya, Denkfiguren in German. And according to Thora-Mattenklot, a figure is a verbal expression that is not entirely fixed in terminological terms, meaning it is not purely a technical term, but it is nevertheless linked to a specific and recognizable context. It has specific echoes or implications, and so it is not completely arbitrary. It is not fixed, but it is not arbitrary. So this is the idea of figure, or the idea of figure tries to capture this shifting and not yet fixed status. يعني سورة الختام هو تعبير ليس ثابتا تماما. يعني الإصلاح ليس تعبير ثابتا من الناحية المصطلحية أو الفكرية، مما يعني أنه ليس مصطلحا تقنيا، لكنه مرتبط بمفاهيم مميزة ومعروفة، وأيضا بسياقات وأشكال الاستخدام ممكنة في إطار العلم الإسلامي المرسخ. So it is not arbitrary, but it is not fixed yet. Selon donc cette définition de Thora-Mattenklot, une figure serait une expression qui n'est pas entièrement fixée sur le plan terminologique, mais qui serait néanmoins liée à des implications identifiables et reconnaissables, ainsi qu'à des contextes et des formes d'utilisation possibles. So based on this approach of discursive figure, what I started with was to collect sources from Moroccan archives, libraries, that have been classified by Mohammed al-Manouni in his المصادر العربية للتاريخ المغرب as كتب البدع. So this developed then in a quite substantial collection of texts, because I did not, as I said, start from looking at concepts, but I started from looking at the ways in which ideas of iṣlāḥ have been employed. So I started with these kutub al-bid'ah. And what I found was that iṣlāḥ, as it appears in real sources, so not in our ideas, but in real sources, iṣlāḥ or related notions are associated with various concerns, ranging from instruction in doctrinal matters to the realm of ritual practice, or even to the enforcement of order by force. If we look for a common thread or leitmotif, it is, I would say, the process of continuous renewal, restoration, renovation itself that is intended, referencing the normative sources of Islam while supporting and being supported by a shared order of mutual recognition and socially embedded forms of power. So now I know that this sounds extremely complicated and far too abstract. I nevertheless wanted to mention this, read this for a first time, in order to again repeat that I wanted to look at the contextuality and the real usages of notions of iṣlāḥ, but I did not mean to dissolve iṣlāḥ completely into disparate discourses. So in order to think of what what links these different usages together, I came up with this definition. But what I will now do in the remaining time is to share with you some concrete examples, and if you like, to unpack what is in this definition. So my study actually owes in this approach and looking at the usages of iṣlāḥ owes much to Abdallah al-Arwi's methodology in his Les origines sociales et culturelles du nationalisme marocain, 1830 to 1912, that was first published in 1977. Al-Arwi himself has described his method as philological. With this, Al-Arwi referred to his relying on normative and narrative sources, or in his terms of the time, ideological sources, in order to trace what he called the social meaning of transformations over the 19th century. So he was less interested with the events themselves that happened. Of course, we need to have a sound knowledge of the events, but this was not the focus of the book. The focus of the book was the perception of these events, the interpretation of these events, and how people would react to events. يعني أستند على منهج عبد الله العروي، وهو منهج وصفه العروي نفسه بأنه فيلولوجي، حيث يعتمد على المصادر النورمية والسردية، بمصطلح العروي المصادر الإيديولوجية، لنفهم المعنى الاجتماعي للتحولات التي جرت في القرن التاسع عشر. And also I very much developed my ideas in reading Abdallah Belqazi's book I have already mentioned on الخطاب الإصلاحي في المغرب, and I will come back to this in a short moment. So I have already said how I selected my sources. I went for the Kutub al-Bid'a. I went through Muhammad al-Manouni's book, and then I tried to have access to as many of these sources as possible, which was, as I said, really a lot to read and to look at. So then what I did in a second step was to try to identify themes or topics that emerge in these sources. So what were the debates, what were the problems of the time that invited scholars to talk about bid'ah or fasad, and so from where did their criticism emerge? And so I decided to have like 3 chapters in the book, focusing each on a specific case study or axis of analysis. And of course, I then had to add other sources in order to make these case studies complete. So I started with looking at as many Kutub al-Bid'ah as possible. I tried to identify topics and contexts of debate and criticism, and I selected 3 of them, and then I added other sources. And to very briefly present the structure of the book, so the first axis is references to iṣlāḥ in representations of power. So I looked at writings by ruling sultans, writings that are from the genre of admonition or nasiha, and I also had the chance to look at a sample of correspondence from the time of Hassan I that was sent to local governors, in which successful harakat were described. And I'm, as you know, Khalid, really indebted to you for having me granted access to this part of your private archives, and also for having shared with me your transcripts of these manuscripts. So this was the first axis. So I looked how references in to iṣlāḥ are present in discourses on representing and legitimizing power. Then the second axis is epistemic authority, the formation of sulta al-ma'rifa or sulta ma'rafiyya among scholars from the urban elite. And I really knowingly choose 2 very well-known scholars so to be able also to relate to the existing research and to be specific about my contribution. And actually I choose Ahmed bin Khalid al-Nasri, died in 1897, and Muhammad bin Ja'far al-Kattani died in 1927. I also in this way covered like 2 generations of scholars. So I looked into how references to iṣlāḥ are part of building, let's say, the authority of an urban scholar. And the third axis consisted of looking at contrasting forms of referencing the Sunnah, the prophetic tradition, in writings on Sufism. And with this, I also wanted to engage with this often taken for granted knowledge that any reformist trend in Islam would be critical of Sufism, especially of specific forms of Sufi practices. So what I found actually was that this is much more complex, and Sufism is indeed part of the cultural capital of scholars of the time. And what I did was to look more specifically at 2 manuscripts that had passed relatively unnoticed until then, focusing on 2 very important and in a way also competing turuq of the 19th century, which were the Nasiriyya and the Darqawiyya. So I was aware of the existing research, and I was also aware that I would encounter a kind of critical conversation between both. But as I said, the way in which both authors or manuscripts refer to the Sunnah and present themselves as muslih questions a lot of these general interpretations of iṣlāḥ as being in itself opposed to traditions, especially Sufism. So in what follows, if I still have the time, or would you prefer me to cut? Okay, I hope I will not use the whole time. But if you are still with me, if you are not too tired, what I could do now in the last section of the presentation is to give you some examples of this second case study or axis of analysis. So to shortly present my reading of Nasri and Kattani and how this relates to the interpretation of iṣlāḥ. Is this okay? Okay, okay, thank you. So I will continue, but be assured that from tomorrow on, my presentations will be slightly shorter. We won't have a more general public, and I will try to react more also to you. So this is not my usual way of teaching. Don't be afraid. So how did I read Ahmed bin Khalid al-Nasri and Muhammad bin Ja'far al-Kattani, if you like, on the basis and at the same time a little bit against the grain of research that existed on them? Both, as I said, are really well known, even though there had at the time not yet been a monograph written about either of them. So I'm not aware whether there has a monograph come out, but when I wrote my book, there was no. Both scholars are nevertheless mentioned in varying degrees in studies on very different topics as witnesses to changes in the scholarly culture of the late 19th and early 20th century. Despite, of course, important differences between studies that exist on them or that mention them, there is a certain pattern that emerges in presentations of both scholars, which can be summarized as the assumption that there existed a contrast between a proponent of an early proponent of modernization, whatever this meant in the late 19th century, a position affiliated with the Mahsan, and here Nasri is the person that is mentioned, and on the other side, a supposedly more state-critical, if not oppositional, traditionalist figure like Kattani. So certainly, I already said there are much more diverse interpretations and the literature is more complex, but for the sake of clarity and in order to make my argument, I will stick with this more conventional presentation. So someone who supported the Mahsen in reforms and who was critical of Sufism, Nasri, so this is the conventional criteria for calling someone a reformist, and then Qahtani, who was much closer to traditional Sufism and also wrote extensively on Sufism as the traditionalist and more critical of the Mahzam, especially also given his family situation. So let me briefly explain what I try to do. So first of all, I try to look into the career and the different writings of both authors, because most of the studies only look at the most well-known writings. For Ahmed bin Khalid al-Nasri, this would be his Kitab al-Istiqsa, which you probably all know, a history of Morocco that was printed in Cairo in 1894, so still during the author's lifetime. The Kitab al-Istiqsa is formally a chronicle, and it is still considered a really important source, particularly for the 19th century. In addition to information about events and individuals, the Kitab al-Istiqsa also contains various thematic texts by the author himself, for example, on military reform, or also very interesting on the nature of freedom, or hurriya, which the author integrated into his text. Other works of the author, and some of which have only recently been made available in print, identify him much more as a legal and a religious scholar. And I'm referring here especially to his Ta'adhim al-Minna bi Nusrat al-Sunnah, which is also listed by Manouni as a Kitab al-Bid'ah. And when I started, it was just available in a manuscript version in Salah. So now it is available in a print edition. So already looking into the different writings and having a broader understanding of what he produced in terms of scholarship helps, I think, to portray Nasri not simply as a functionary of the Mahsen or a historian of the Mahsen. Actually, also, if we look at his biography, we see that he established himself as a scholar before he joined the service of the Mahsen, and then also, also from, through birth, but also, or lineage, but also in his work, Nasri was, of course, closely affiliated to the Nasiriyya Sufi Brotherhood, and he even devoted a 2-volume book on this. So as soon as you start reading these different texts and trying to understand what he wanted to say and what kind of problems he discussed and how he analyzed the society in which he lived, the picture gets more complicated. In contrast to Nasri, Muhammad bin Ja'far al-Qahtani is primarily portrayed in conventional studies as a traditionally minded scholar, and therefore somewhat inevitably critical of the Mahsen, especially the administrative reforms and military reform. This reputation of Qahtani being a traditionalist is mainly based on, again, selecting one book for which he became famous, the Kitab Salwat al-Anfas. The Kitab Salwat al-Anfas is a biographical collection of saints, scholars, descendants of the Prophet buried in Fez, with entries organized in concentric circles following the arrangement, the topographic arrangement of the grave sites over Fez, starting from the city center and moving to the periphery. However, in addition to these stories about scholars and saints, the Kitab Salwat al-Anfas also contains a quite comprehensive and interesting introduction